I am Zuri, 35 years old. At my grandfather's 80th birthday dinner, my father stood up before the wealthiest families in Atlanta and smirked across the table. He told me I did not deserve to carry our last name. My brother actually clapped. The entire ballroom held its breath, waiting for me to shatter. Instead, my grandfather slowly got to his feet and said words that would destroy my father's entire empire. Before I reveal the masterstroke that brought them to their knees, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe that true legacy is built on respect, not manipulation. The crystal chandeliers of the Oakhead Country Club cast a warm, golden glow over 50 of Atlanta's most influential residents. Waitstaff in crisp white jackets floated silently between the tables, pouring expensive vintage champagne into long stem flutes. The aroma of roasted duck and aged wine filled the air. It was my grandfather Josiah's 80th birthday. It was a milestone that demanded the utmost respect, a celebration of a man who had survived Jim Crow and built a foundation for our family from the ground up. I sat near the head of the main table, wearing a tailored emerald green suit, quietly nursing a glass of sparkling water. I was there solely for my grandfather. He was the only man who had ever taught me the true value of a dollar and the heavy weight of personal integrity. My father, Jeremiah, sat directly opposite me. He spent the entire first hour of the evening loudly boasting about the family luxury car dealership to anyone who would listen. He was a man who loved the sound of his own voice, completely intoxicated by his perceived power within the local business community. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo that screamed of new money desperation, constantly adjusting his cuffs to make sure his diamond links caught the light. Sitting right next to him was my younger brother Jamal. Jamal was the undisputed golden child, the heir apparent who wore expensive suits but could not balance a basic financial ledger to save his life. He sat there swirling a glass of top-shelf bourbon he certainly had not paid for. I could see the faint sheen of sweat forming on his brow, the nervous, erratic energy he always carried when he was hiding a massive financial failure. Beside Jamal sat his wife Ashley, a white woman who had married into our family 2 years ago and immediately adopted a persona of extreme entitlement. She spent the evening snapping her fingers at the catering staff and loudly complaining about the temperature of her soup. I watched them all with the detached observation of a professional. I ran my own wealth management firm. It was a company I built entirely from the ground up after my parents flatly refused to pay a single dime toward my college tuition. They had cut me off at 18 because I refused to major in what they demanded, telling me I would fail out in the real world. Now I managed investment portfolios worth more than their entire showroom combined. It was a fact they actively ignored because it did not fit their narrative of the successful father and the brilliant son. As the jazz quartet in the corner finished their elegant set, the room settled into a comfortable low murmur. Jeremiah picked up a heavy silver butter knife and tapped it sharply against his crystal champagne flute. The high-pitched chime cut through the conversation like a razor blade. The room fell completely silent. Pastors, politicians, and old money families all turned their eyes toward the patriarch of our table. Jeremiah stood up, smoothing his designer tie, his chest puffed out with absolute arrogance. "We are gathered here tonight to celebrate my father Josiah," Jeremiah began. His voice boomed across the lavish ballroom, deep and practiced. "But tonight is also about looking forward. It is about the future of Black excellence. It is about building a legacy that will stand the test of time. That is why I am incredibly proud to officially announce that my son Jamal is taking over as the sole president of our dealership operations." A smattering of polite applause rippled through the room. Jamal puffed out his chest, leaning back in his chair with a triumphant grin. Ashley leaned over and kissed his cheek, casting a superior glance in my direction. But Jeremiah was not finished. The polite applause faded, and the atmosphere in the room shifted. His eyes, cold and calculating, locked directly onto me. The fake warmth vanished from his face, entirely replaced by a cruel, rigid sneer. "Legacy requires absolute loyalty," Jeremiah said. His voice dropped to a dangerous carrying register that ensured every single person in the room could hear his next words. It requires blood to support blood. It requires a family to move as one united front. Zuri, your constant refusal to support this family's ventures is an absolute disgrace. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. People averted their eyes, but nobody could look away from the spectacle unfolding at the center table. I felt the heavy gaze of the Atlanta elite pressing down on my shoulders. Jeremiah leaned forward, planting both hands flat on the linen tablecloth. When your brother needed capital for his downtown expansion, you turned your back on him. You sit in your fancy downtown office, playing with other people's money, while refusing to lift a single finger for your own flesh and blood. You are selfish. You have brought nothing but embarrassment to our table. You do not deserve to carry our last name. Therefore, I am making it public tonight. I am legally severing your ties to the family trust. You are cut off. The silence was absolutely deafening. Someone near the back of the room let out a sharp gasp. Jamal, completely emboldened by our father's extreme cruelty, actually raised his hands and began to slowly clap. The sound echoed off the high ceiling, mocking and rhythmic. He looked at me with a twisted smirk that practically dared me to cry. He was waiting for me to beg. He wanted me to cause a massive scene that would confirm every terrible rumor they had ever spread about me being the emotional, difficult, ungrateful daughter. I looked around the enormous table. I saw the quiet pity in the eyes of the extended family members who were far too cowardly to speak up in my defense. I saw the eager, malicious anticipation glowing in my father's face. He was waiting for my spirit to break into a million pieces right there over the dinner plates. But I had stopped seeking their validation a decade ago. I managed crisis communications for billionaires. I knew exactly how to handle a hostile ambush. I reached out with a steady hand and picked up my heavy linen napkin. I calmly dabbed the corner of my mouth. I picked up my crystal glass of sparkling water, took a slow, deliberate sip, and set it down exactly on the center of the coaster. I looked directly into my father's eyes, refusing to blink, refusing to offer him a single ounce of the pain he so desperately craved. "I understand, Jeremiah," I said. My voice was perfectly even. It carried clearly across the silent room, without a shred of anger, sorrow, or fear. I did not call him Dad. I stripped him of the title he had just abused. I will have my attorneys drop the name by Monday morning. For a fraction of a second, the smug satisfaction melted entirely off my father's face. He had expected flooding tears. He had expected a screaming match that would validate his decision to cut me out. My absolute icy composure threw him completely off balance. The power dynamic he tried to violently force had shattered against my complete indifference. The room remained suffocatingly quiet, the tension stretching so tight it felt like the crystal glasses might shatter. But before Jeremiah could recover his footing and launch another verbal assault, the chair to his right scraped violently against the hardwood floor. My mother Valerie stood up quickly. Her designer pearls caught the light as she glared down at me. Her face twisted with deep, righteous indignation. She could sense her husband losing the upper hand, and she was more than ready to step in and twist the knife even further. "Don't you dare use that tone with your father," my mother snapped, her voice trembling with that perfectly practiced aristocratic outrage she loved to weaponize at social events. Valerie's chair screeched against the polished hardwood floor as she leaned across the table. Her heavy imported South Sea pearls clinked against her crystal salad plate. She pointed a perfectly manicured French-tipped finger directly at my face, completely ignoring the fact that half the country club was now watching our table with undisguised fascination. "You sit there acting like you are completely above this family, Zuri. If you had just done your job and helped your brother secure those downtown zoning permits for the new commercial lot, your father would not have been forced to make this difficult decision. But no, you had to be stubborn. You had to selfishly hoard your political connections for your own little finance firm, while your own flesh and blood was struggling to expand our legacy." I looked at my mother, genuinely marveling at her ability to rewrite history in real time. My little finance firm was currently managing over $600 million in client assets. Jamal was struggling to keep the lights on at a luxury dealership he inherited, but did not know how to run. I didn't pull those permits because Jamal didn't have the capital to build on that land, let alone develop a commercial district, I replied, keeping my voice terrifyingly steady. I refused to match her hysterical, breathless pitch. He leveraged the existing showroom inventory to cover a string of catastrophic high-risk loans. He didn't need a zoning permit, Mother. He needed a miracle to stop the bank from seizing his existing assets. Jamal shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting toward the elite investors and real estate moguls sitting at the adjacent tables. "Keep your voice down," he hissed, suddenly terrified that the affluent crowd might hear the undeniable truth about his so-called business acumen. I ignored him entirely, keeping my eyes locked on the woman who had birthed me. "You want to talk about being selfish?" I asked, leaning back in my chair and folding my hands in my lap. "You and Jeremiah refused to pay a single semester of my tuition because I chose wealth management over working the dealership floor. You told me I would be back begging for a job within a year. Meanwhile, you paid for Jamal to fail out of 2 different business programs, bought him 3 separate luxury cars that he immediately totaled, and handed him an executive title he cannot even spell. Now you expect me to leverage my firm's immaculate reputation to clean up his impending bankruptcy. That is not family loyalty, Mother. That is financial suicide." Valerie gasped, clutching her pearls in a gesture so melodramatic it belonged in a stage play rather than a dining room. "You have always been terribly envious of your brother," she declared, shaking her head in mock sorrow, trying to spin the narrative back in her favor. "From the time you were children, you simply could not stand the fact that Jamal was destined to lead our empire. You started your little company just to prove a point, and now you are actively trying to tear him down because you cannot handle his success." The sheer delusion of her statement was suffocating. I was a 35-year-old self-made chief executive officer sitting across from a 32-year-old man who still had his mother schedule his annual dental appointments and balance his checkbook. There was absolutely nothing to envy. Before I could verbally dismantle my mother's ridiculous fantasy, a soft, trembling sniffle broke through the thick tension at the table. I slowly turned my gaze to the right. Ashley Jamal's wife was delicately pressing a linen napkin beneath her eyes, being incredibly careful not to smudge her expensive mascara. She had been waiting for her moment to enter the spotlight, and my mother's theatrics had given her the perfect opening. "Zuri, please," Ashley whimpered, her voice dripping with a cloying, weaponized fragility. "We are just trying to build something lasting here. Jamal works so incredibly hard for this family. We just want to secure generational wealth for our children. You know how important Black excellence is in today's society, but you just completely refuse to be a team player." The temperature of my blood spiked to an absolute boiling point. I sat entirely motionless, letting her absurd, deeply offensive words hang in the air. A white woman sitting at a banquet table paid for by the blood and sweat of a Black patriarch who had endured the violent reality of the Jim Crow South was lecturing me, a self-made Black female executive, about the importance of Black excellence. She was hijacking the language of my culture, using it as a convenient shield to protect her incompetent husband's financial blunders. The absolute audacity was so staggering it practically vibrated through the floorboards. I stared at Ashley, watching the fake tears pool in the corners of her eyes. She knew exactly what she was doing. In the elite social circles of Atlanta, the delicate, crying daughter-in-law was a highly effective weapon. She was actively playing the victim, casting me as the aggressive, uncooperative, and angry antagonist who was trying to rip the food out of her future children's mouths. It was a calculated performance designed to manipulate the wealthy onlookers, to make them whisper about the bitter, successful sister who coldly refused to help her struggling brother. "You want to talk to me about Black excellence?" I asked, my voice dropping an octave, carrying a dangerous razor-sharp edge that made the nearby waiter step back. "You want to invoke generational wealth while your husband is actively squandering the very foundation this family was built upon. Do not ever dare use my culture as a buzzword to cover up his gross incompetence." Ashley let out a soft, wounded gasp, shrinking back against Jamal's shoulder as if I had physically struck her. Jamal instantly puffed out his chest, slamming his hand flat against the table, rattling the silverware. "Do not speak to my wife like that!" he barked eagerly, playing the role of the valiant protector. "She is just trying to make you see reason. You are tearing this family apart, Zuri. You are sitting there with all your wealth and all your high-level connections watching us drown, and you are enjoying it." "I am not enjoying anything, Jamal," I replied coldly, staring directly into his panicked eyes. "I am simply refusing to set myself on fire to keep you warm. You made your disastrous financial choices behind closed doors. Now you get to experience the public consequences. That is how the real world operates. The world outside this country club. The world outside our parents' overflowing checkbook." Valerie leaned over again, completely ignoring the undeniable truth of my words. "You are a bitter, spiteful woman, Zuri," she hissed, her voice low enough to avoid the microphones of the jazz band, but loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear every venomous syllable. "Look at you. No husband, no children, just cold, hard ambition. You think your money keeps you warm at night? We are offering you a chance to be part of something bigger than your own selfish ego. We are giving you the opportunity to show this community that the family stands united. But you would rather watch your own brother fail than step up and do what is right." The emotional manipulation was a masterclass in psychological warfare. They were twisting my refusal to participate in bank fraud into a moral failing. They were using my single status and my fierce dedication to my career as evidence of a fundamentally flawed character. In their eyes, my independence was an aggressive act of defiance against the established family hierarchy. A dutiful daughter was supposed to support the men in her life, not effortlessly outshine them. Ashley, sensing that Valerie's harsh words had not cracked my composure, decided to try a different, far more intrusive tactic. She leaned across the table, her blonde hair falling over her shoulder, projecting an aura of a desperate, pleading peacekeeper. "Zuri, we can fix this," she murmured softly, her tone laced with a sickly, sweet condescension that made my skin crawl. "We can all just forgive and forget. Jamal is willing to overlook the disrespect. Your father is willing to let you back into the trust. Just call your contacts at the city planning office on Monday morning. That is all we ask of you. We are family. We have to stick together." Then she did the unthinkable. Ashley reached her arm across the pristine white tablecloth. She extended her hand and placed it directly over mine. She patted my skin with two slow, patronizing taps, as if she were soothing a feral, misbehaving animal that needed to be calmed. The unwanted physical contact sent a shockwave of absolute fury through my entire system. It was the ultimate gesture of disrespect, a physical manifestation of her assumed, unearned superiority. I looked down at her manicured fingers resting on my hand, then slowly raised my eyes to meet hers. The fake sympathy in her gaze faltered immediately as she saw the sheer, unadulterated warning burning in my expression. I opened my mouth, fully prepared to verbally decimate her. I was ready to strip away every ounce of her entitlement and expose the fraudulent nature of her marriage and her luxurious lifestyle in front of 50 of the city's most influential people. I was fully prepared to bring the entire facade crashing down to the floor right then and there. But before I could utter a single syllable, a sound cut through the suffocating tension of the dining room. Thump. It was a heavy, rhythmic sound. Thump. Thump. The solid, undeniable impact of a carved mahogany cane striking the polished hardwood floor. The hushed whispers of the surrounding guests evaporated instantly. The jazz quartet abruptly stopped playing mid-note, the musicians freezing in place. I pulled my hand away from Ashley's grip and turned my attention toward the head of the table. Grandpa Josiah, who had remained entirely silent and motionless throughout the entire agonizing ambush, was no longer sitting. He had gripped the edge of the table with his weathered, calloused hands, and slowly, with the agonizing effort of an 80-year-old man who carried the heavy weight of a turbulent century in his bones, pulled himself to his feet. His broad shoulders straightened his imposing frame, casting a long, heavy shadow that stretched directly across my father's plate. The entire ballroom seemed to freeze in time. Waiters stopped with silver trays hovering in midair. The clinking of crystal and the soft hum of affluent conversation vanished completely, replaced by a thick, suffocating silence. My grandfather, Josiah Holloway, did not demand attention. He simply commanded it by existing. He had spent his youth laying bricks and working on assembly lines before buying up real estate in Atlanta when nobody else would lend to a black man. He built a foundation of absolute granite so that men like my father could eventually wear Italian silk and pretend they were self-made royalty. Jeremiah swallowed hard, the sharp movement of his Adam's apple visible above his heavily starched collar. He forced a tight, incredibly nervous smile, trying desperately to regain control of the room. "Josiah, please," Jeremiah said, his voice dropping into a placating, patronizing tone that he usually reserved for difficult clients. "Sit down. You are overexerting yourself. We are just having a private family discussion about corporate restructuring. This is not something you need to concern yourself with tonight. Tonight is about celebrating your long life." My grandfather did not blink. He slowly turned his head, fixing his piercing, unyielding gaze directly onto Jeremiah. The look was so filled with absolute, unfiltered disgust that Jeremiah actually shrank back into his upholstered chair. "You think your name means power?" Jeremiah, my grandfather said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that carried flawlessly to the very back of the ballroom. "You sit here in your velvet chair drinking $1,000 wine, and you genuinely believe that the sterling name is the bedrock of this empire. You forgot who built the ground you are standing on. You forgot who laid the bricks while you were busy polishing the windows." My mother reached out, her face pale, her perfectly manicured fingers trembling. "Daddy, please," she begged, her aristocratic facade entirely shattered. "Do not do this here. Not in front of the entire country club. Jeremiah is just doing what is necessary to protect the business. Zuri has been completely uncooperative." Josiah slammed the base of his mahogany cane against the floor again, the sharp crack silencing her instantly. "Do not speak to me about protecting a business you know absolutely nothing about, Valerie. I watched you enable this fool for 30 years, and I watched you both coddle a boy who cannot even tie his own shoelaces without asking for a corporate bailout." He turned his heavy gaze away from his daughter and his son-in-law, sweeping his eyes across the lavish ballroom. He looked at the politicians, the real estate developers, and the banking executives who had just witnessed my public humiliation. Then he looked directly at me. His eyes softened for just a fraction of a second, communicating decades of mutual understanding and silent respect. "If Zuri is not worthy of your name," my grandfather announced, his voice ringing with absolute authority, "then she will carry mine. She will carry the Holloway name. And she will carry absolutely everything that comes with it." Jeremiah let out a short, breathless laugh, a sound of pure, desperate confusion. "What are you talking about, Josiah? The dealership is in my name. The inventory is in Jamal's name. We own the empire. You retired a decade ago. You are an honorary chairman. You have no legal authority to interfere with the Sterling dealership assets." My grandfather leaned forward, resting both hands on the smooth, polished head of his cane. He looked at Jeremiah with the cold, calculating pity of a chess grandmaster looking at a novice who had just blundered his queen. "You own the cars, Jeremiah," my grandfather said, emphasizing every single word. "You own the glass showroom. You own the fancy neon signs. But you do not own the dirt those cars sit on. You have never owned the dirt." A collective murmur rippled through the surrounding tables as the elite business minds in the room instantly connected the dots. Jeremiah's face lost all its color, turning a sickly ashen gray. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Through a rapid-fire delivery that completely stripped away years of carefully maintained corporate secrecy, my grandfather laid bare the ultimate truth of the family wealth. He explained to the entire room that the dealership empire, the sprawling lots in Buckhead, the service centers downtown, and the massive commercial storage facilities did not belong to Jeremiah. They had never belonged to Jeremiah. They were entirely built on land owned exclusively by my grandfather's original holding company, Holloway Enterprises. For 30 years, my grandfather explained, his voice echoing over the dead silent crowd, "I have leased every single square inch of commercial real estate to your dealership for pennies on the dollar. I gave you 99-year leases at rates that practically subsidized your entire luxury lifestyle. I did it because Valerie asked me to. I did it because I wanted my grandchildren to have a foundation. But I never signed over the deeds. Holloway Enterprises owns the very soil your empire is parked on. Jamal shot up from his chair tumbling backward and crashing onto the floor. His hands were shaking violently. He looked at our grandfather as if the elderly man had just transformed into a monster. "But the land is ours," Jamal stammered, his voice cracking with pure panic. "We use that land as collateral. The banks look at our operational footprint. You cannot just bring this up now." "I can, and I am." Josiah countered, his voice cutting through Jamal's panic like a scythe. "Because as of this morning, I am no longer the majority shareholder of Holloway Enterprises. I am bypassing the two of you completely. I am officially transferring 100% of my shares, my voting rights, and the deeds to every single piece of commercial real estate under the Holloway umbrella directly to Zuri." The paperwork was filed, signed, and legally expedited at 9 o'clock this morning. It is effective immediately. The power dynamic in the room flipped with such violent immediate force that it practically created a vacuum. I sat there in my emerald suit, my heart hammering a steady, powerful rhythm against my ribs. I knew my grandfather owned the original holding company, but I never anticipated he would execute a complete unilateral transfer of power right at the dinner table. The realization hit the surrounding tables like a shockwave. Wealth managers, real estate tycoons, and bankers were actively doing the math in their heads. They realized exactly what I had just realized. Jeremiah and Jamal did not just lose their leverage, they lost their independence. The 99-year sweetheart leases my grandfather had established contained strict morality and operational clauses that I now had the absolute unmitigated power to enforce, renegotiate, or terminate. I was no longer the outcast daughter. I was no longer the scapegoat they could publicly humiliate and cut off from the family trust. I was now the sole owner of the ground their business occupied. I was their landlord. Ashley sat completely frozen, her weaponized tears drying instantly on her pale cheeks. The patronizing hand she had just placed on mine slowly retracted, sliding back across the white linen tablecloth as if she had just touched a hot stove. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, the sudden realization of her husband's absolute lack of power crashing down on her carefully constructed reality. Jamal grabbed the edge of the table, his knuckles turning stark white. He looked completely unhinged. The arrogant clapping brother from 5 minutes ago had been completely obliterated. "No, Grandpa, you cannot do this to me," Jamal pleaded, his voice rising to a shrill, desperate pitch that stripped away any remaining illusion of black excellence or corporate composure. "You do not understand what you are doing. The downtown loans, the commercial expansion. The bank requires proof of long-term land security. If Zuri controls the holding company, they will trigger a total audit of my expansion capital." His words tumbled out in a frantic, uncoordinated rush. He was practically hyperventilating, entirely exposing the fact that he had leveraged assets he did not fully control. He had built a massive house of cards on a foundation of sand, and my grandfather had just handed me the deed to the beach. Jeremiah slammed both of his fists onto the table with a deafening crash that made the silverware jump. His face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The veins in his neck bulged against his collar. He abandoned any pretense of Southern hospitality or country club decorum. "You have lost your mind, old man," Jeremiah roared, pointing a trembling finger at Josiah. "You are senile. You have completely lost your grip on reality. I will have you declared legally incompetent by Monday morning. I will drag you into a courtroom, and I will have a judge tear up those transfer papers before the ink even dries." Then he turned his furious, bloodshot eyes toward me. He leaned over the table, his breath coming in ragged, angry heaves. "And as for you," he snarled, his voice a venomous, hateful whisper that cut through the silence. "You think you have won something today. You think a piece of paper makes you a titan. You have no idea what you have just stepped into. I will use every single favor, every single contact, and every single dollar in the Sterling Trust to absolutely crush your little finance firm. I will strip your clients. I will ruin your professional reputation. I will destroy you before you even have the chance to open your doors on Monday morning." I sat perfectly still, absorbing the full weight of his threat. I did not flinch. I did not look away. I simply reached forward, picked up my glass of sparkling water, and took another slow, deliberate sip. The war had officially begun. I set my crystal glass down on the coaster. The soft clink echoed like a gavel striking wood. I did not look at Jeremiah's purple rage-contorted face. I did not look at Jamal's panicked, sweating brow, or Ashley's pale, terrified features. I simply stood up, smoothed the front of my emerald green suit, and offered my arm to my grandfather. Josiah took it with a firm, steady grip. We turned our backs on the most powerful families in Atlanta and walked out of the Oakhead Country Club ballroom. The absolute silence of the crowd parted for us like the Red Sea. Nobody dared to breathe, let alone speak, as the true patriarch of the family and his newly crowned successor made their exit. The ride back to my grandfather's sprawling countryside estate was wrapped in a comfortable, heavy quiet. He stared out the window of the town car at the passing streetlights, his hands resting on his mahogany cane. When we finally pulled up to his driveway, he turned to me. His eyes were clear and sharp. He told me that Jeremiah was a desperate man who had built his entire identity on the illusion of control, and desperate men never fought fair. He warned me to brace for impact, because the retaliation would be swift and brutal. I kissed his cheek, promised him I was ready, and drove back to my condo in the city. By Tuesday morning, I realized my grandfather had underestimated their viciousness. The Sterling family propaganda machine was operating at maximum capacity, and they had deployed their most highly effective weapon first. It started on social media. Ashley, utilizing her massive online following, built on showcasing her seemingly perfect, wealthy, blended family, posted a highly edited 7-minute video. I sat in my downtown office, watching it on my tablet, my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. She sat in her pristine, neutral-toned living room wearing absolutely no makeup. Her blonde hair was pulled into a messy bun to project maximum vulnerability. She stared directly into the camera, her eyes brimming with weaponized tears that fell at perfectly timed intervals. She did not use my name, but she painted a devastatingly clear picture for her hundreds of thousands of followers. She wept openly about how a greedy, estranged family member had preyed upon an elderly, confused patriarch. She sobbed about how this bitter relative had manipulated a vulnerable man suffering from the early stages of dementia, forcing him to sign over the very land that provided for her innocent children. She invoked faith, crying about how the devil uses jealousy to tear loving families apart. She ended the video by asking her followers to pray for her husband, a hard-working man whose generational legacy was being stolen by a malicious, money-hungry woman. The sheer societal audacity of the video was breathtaking. She knew exactly what she was doing. In the affluent circles of Atlanta, the delicate crying daughter-in-law was an incredibly powerful social tool. She was weaponizing her fragility against me, painting me as the aggressive, unhinged black woman actively trying to destroy a family. The fallout was instantaneous. The video went viral within our social and professional circles. By noon, my mother's phone was undoubtedly ringing off the hook. Prominent church members, charity board directors, and community leaders were all calling Valerie to offer their deepest sympathies for her wayward, wicked daughter. I was instantly branded as an elder abuser, a corporate thief, and a disgrace to the community. My social media channels were flooded with vile comments from strangers calling me a monster. I turned off my phone notifications and took a deep breath, refusing to let the public humiliation break my focus. I knew a smear campaign was just the opening salvo. The real attack was coming for my livelihood. At exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon, my lead broker Marcus knocked on my heavy glass office door. He looked physically ill. He walked in, shut the door tightly behind him, and dropped a stack of heavily redacted portfolios onto my desk. Jeremiah was not bluffing at the dinner table. He had spent the last 48 hours cashing in 30 years of golf course favors and country club handshakes. Marcus informed me that two of our biggest anchor clients, both old money Atlanta real estate moguls who played poker with my father every single Sunday, had just called to terminate their contracts. They were pulling over $30 million in assets under management from our firm effective immediately. They cited vague concerns about recent shifts in corporate leadership and personal character, a direct echo of Ashley's viral video and my father's behind-the-scenes poison. Losing $30 million in a single afternoon was a catastrophic bleeding wound for an independent firm like mine. It threatened our quarterly projections, our operational budget, and the bonuses of the employees who relied on me. Marcus stood there sweating, asking me what our crisis management protocol was going to be. He wanted to know if we should draft a press release or seek legal counsel for defamation. I looked up at Marcus, maintaining an expression of complete unbothered calm. I told him to process the client withdrawals immediately, without a single word of protest or negotiation. I instructed him to send them a complimentary bottle of our best corporate wine with a polite thank you note for their past business. When people show you they can be bought with country club gossip, you hold the door open for them to leave. Marcus nodded, his panic subsiding slightly in the face of my absolute certainty, and left the office to execute my orders. As soon as the door clicked shut, my private office line rang. I did not need to check the caller ID to know exactly who was on the other end. I picked up the receiver and pressed it to my ear without saying a word. "Are you ready to stop this ridiculous tantrum, Zuri?" My mother's voice flowed through the speaker. It was thick with a toxic honey-coated condescension. Valerie sounded incredibly pleased with herself, entirely convinced that the combination of Ashley's character assassination and Jeremiah's financial sabotage had brought me to my knees. "You have caused quite enough embarrassment for 1 week," Valerie continued, her tone shifting into the patronizing cadence she used when scolding a toddler. "Your father is furious, but he is a reasonable man. I have spoken to him. I have calmed him down. We are offering you a compromise. You are going to sign the holding company over to Jamal today. If you drop this foolish vendetta and transfer the deeds, we will publicly forgive you. Ashley will take down her little video. Your father will make a few calls and get your clients back." I listened to her breathe, the sheer manipulation of her offer hanging in the air. "Do not make us destroy you, Zuri," my mother warned, her voice dropping the maternal act and exposing the cold steel beneath. "You are completely out of your depth. You cannot win a war against your own blood. Sign the papers, or by Friday, your little firm will not even exist." I did not yell. I did not defend my character or try to explain the utter depravity of Ashley using dementia as a buzzword to garner social media sympathy. I simply lowered the phone and pressed the glowing red button to disconnect the call. I was done speaking to them. Instead of engaging in a public relations war I could not win, I locked my office door, closed the privacy blinds, and opened the heavy fireproof safe hidden behind my bookshelf. Inside was a thick, leather-bound ledger my grandfather had given me that morning, along with a secure flash drive containing the master financial records of Holloway Enterprises. I sat down at my desk, booted up my secure terminal, and began to do what I did best. I stopped reacting and started analyzing. I pored over the corporate tax filings from the last 5 years. I cross-referenced the incredibly low lease payments the dealership was making to the holding company against the public financial disclosures Jamal had filed for his recent massive showroom expansions. For hours, the only sound in my office was the rapid clicking of my keyboard and the scratching of my pen on a legal pad. I traced the operational costs. I looked at the property valuations. I dug deep into the leveraging ratios. Suddenly, my hands stopped moving. My eyes locked onto a specific sequence of numbers buried deep within a subsidiary tax filing from 18 months ago. I read the column once. I read it twice. The air in my office suddenly felt freezing cold. My pulse thundered in my ears as the horrifying reality of what I was looking at finally clicked into place. Jamal had not just mismanaged the dealership. He had not just made a few bad investments or overspent on luxury inventory. He had committed a financial sin so massive, so recklessly illegal, that it threatened to bring down the federal authorities on all of their heads. And my father had been actively covering it up. The smear campaign, the panic at the dinner table, the aggressive threats, it was not about losing face. It was about staying out of federal prison. I stared at the glowing screen, my blood running absolutely cold. The numbers sitting in front of me were not just an indicator of bad business. They were the unmistakable fingerprint of a federal crime. I pulled the subsidiary tax filings closer, running my index finger down the columns of Jamal's commercial expansion ledger. For the past 2 years, my father had praised Jamal for his aggressive growth strategy, bragging at every country club dinner about how his son was taking the sterling name into high-end real estate development. The reality was a catastrophic house of cards. Jamal had attempted to develop a multi-use luxury commercial district on the south side of the city. It was supposed to be a vanity project, a gleaming monument to his non-existent business genius. But construction had stalled out 6 months ago. Permits were denied, contractors walked off the job due to unpaid invoices, and the city ultimately condemned the half-built structures. What I was looking at now was the absolute desperation of a man trying to hide a massive failure. To keep the project afloat, Jamal had secured a $25 million loan. Traditional banks would never approve that level of capital for a stalled project with zero projected revenue. So Jamal went to the shadow market. He borrowed the money from Obsidian Equity Partners, a ruthless high-yield private lending group known for predatory interest rates and seizing assets the second a client defaulted. But Obsidian Equity would never hand over $25 million without ironclad collateral. I opened another secure file on the flash drive, digging into the exact terms of the loan agreement. My eyes scanned the digital signatures, and a wave of pure disgust washed over me. Jamal had not used the dealerships as collateral. They were already leveraged to the breaking point. Instead, he had pledged the physical land beneath the dealerships, the land owned exclusively by Holloway Enterprises, the land my grandfather had just legally transferred to me. The mechanics of his fraud were laid bare on the screen. Jamal did not own that land, which meant he had zero legal authority to pledge it as collateral. I pulled up the warranty deed attached to the Obsidian Equity loan application. There at the bottom of the final page was my grandfather Josiah's signature. It was a clumsy, desperate forgery. Jamal had falsified our grandfather's signature and presented fraudulent corporate resolutions claiming he had the authority to leverage Holloway assets. My brother had committed federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft. If the authorities saw this ledger, Jamal would not just lose his title at the dealership. He would face decades in a federal penitentiary. I leaned back in my leather chair, the material creaking loudly in the silent office. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with terrifying clarity. This was exactly why Jeremiah had staged that public ambush at the country club. This was why he was so desperate to publicly sever my ties to the family trust and humiliate me in front of the entire Atlanta elite. He knew about the fraud. He had actively helped Jamal cover it up. Jeremiah was bleeding the operational capital from the legitimate car dealerships just to cover the massive monthly interest payments to Obsidian Equity. He was bankrupting his own legacy to protect his golden boy. But the interest payments were no longer enough. The loan documents contained a balloon clause. The entire $25 million principal plus exorbitant late fees was due in exactly 10 days. If they defaulted, Obsidian Equity would immediately execute their rights on the collateral. They would seize the Holloway land. They would evict the dealerships. The entire Sterling Empire would be liquidated overnight. Jamal had panicked at the dinner table because my grandfather transferring the holding company to me meant I would immediately have access to these exact financial records. I would see the forged deed. I would see the $25 million shadow loan. My mother's toxic phone call suddenly made perfect sense. Valerie did not care about family unity. She cared about saving her son from federal prison. Her offer to forgive me if I just signed the holding company over to Jamal was a desperate attempt to put the stolen assets back into his hands before Obsidian Equity came calling for their balloon payment. They needed the deeds in Jamal's name so he could legally sell the land to cover the fraudulent debt. I felt a deep, sickening knot twist in my stomach. My own parents were entirely willing to sacrifice my professional reputation, my emotional well-being, and my position in the family just to cover up a felony committed by my brother. They were ready to let me take the public fall as a bitter, jealous outcast so Jamal could quietly clean up a $25 million catastrophe. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my desk as the city of Atlanta slowly woke up outside my window. The sky turned a bruised shade of purple, then a pale, unforgiving gray. I printed out every single page of the fraudulent loan agreements, the forged warranty deeds, and the internal dealership ledgers showing the illegal transfer of operational funds. I compiled them into a thick, undeniable dossier of criminal behavior. I secured the master flash drive back inside my fireproof safe. At 8 o'clock in the morning, the heavy glass doors of my wealth management firm unlocked. The usual hum of my employees arriving for work began to filter through the walls of my private office. I knew the atmosphere out there was tense. My staff had undoubtedly seen Ashley's viral video crying about elder abuse, and they had definitely felt the panic of losing $30 million in client assets the previous afternoon. At 8:15, Marcus walked into my office. He did not knock. He looked even worse than he had yesterday. His face was drawn and he was holding a thick, rigid cardboard envelope in his hand. He walked directly to my desk and set it down in front of me. "It just arrived via private courier," Marcus said. His voice was tight, carefully controlled to mask his anxiety. The courier demanded a signature from a corporate officer. "It is from Harrison and Vance." Harrison and Vance was one of the most ruthless, expensive corporate litigation firms in the state of Georgia. They were the legal attack dogs the elite families used when they wanted to completely obliterate their opponents. I stared at the stiff cardboard envelope, recognizing my father's aggressive tactics immediately. I picked up a silver letter opener sliced through the heavy adhesive seal and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on premium watermarked paper. I read the top page and a sharp, cynical laugh actually escaped my throat. Jeremiah had officially declared war. The documents were a formal notice of an emergency injunction filed in the Fulton County Superior Court. My father was legally challenging my grandfather, Josiah's mental competency. He had submitted a petition to have Josiah declared medically unfit to manage his own affairs, claiming severe dementia and cognitive decline. The lawsuit explicitly named me as a predatory, estranged relative who had used undue influence and emotional manipulation to coerce a mentally incapacitated elder into signing over a multi-million-dollar real estate holding company. Jeremiah was demanding that the court immediately freeze all assets related to Holloway Enterprises, nullify the transfer deeds, and appoint him as the sole legal conservator over my grandfather's estate. It was a brilliant, utterly ruthless legal maneuver. By filing for a conservatorship, Jeremiah was attempting to legally trap the land deeds in probate limbo, buying Jamal enough time to renegotiate the balloon payment with Obsidian Equity. More importantly, it was a public execution of my character. The lawsuit would become public record. The business community would see the legal filing, and it would perfectly validate every single lie Ashley had spun in her crying video. They were framing me as a criminal to hide their own crimes. They wanted to strip my grandfather of his dignity, his autonomy, and his legacy, diagnosing a perfectly brilliant 80-year-old man with dementia just to save a 32-year-old fraudster from facing the consequences of his own entitlement. Marcus stood on the other side of the desk, watching my face for a reaction. He knew the survival of our firm hinged entirely on how I responded to this massive legal threat. "They are requesting an emergency hearing for Friday," Marcus said quietly. "If the judge grants the injunction, your assets will be completely frozen. We will not be able to operate the holding company." I looked down at the forged signatures I had uncovered during the night, then looked at the lawsuit my father had just delivered. Jeremiah and Jamal thought they were playing a game of intimidation. They thought that because I was a woman, because I was the daughter they had always dismissed, I would fold under the pressure of a high-profile legal battle and community outrage. They truly believed I would surrender the land just to make the public nightmare stop. They had no idea that I held the match that could burn their entire lives to the ground. I placed the lawsuit neatly on the corner of my desk. I looked up at Marcus, my voice completely stripped of emotion, radiating nothing but absolute focused intent. Cancel all of my internal meetings for the rest of the week, I told him. Do not issue a single public statement regarding my father or the dealership. Let them keep talking. Let Ashley keep posting her videos. Let them build their public narrative as high as they possibly can. Marcus nodded, though he still looked incredibly nervous. What are we going to do about the lawsuit? He asked. I picked up the file containing Jamal's forged loan documents and placed it securely in my briefcase. My family just went for the throat, I said, standing up and buttoning my suit jacket. It is time for me to go for the jugular. Marcus nodded, swallowing hard, and backed out of my office, pulling the heavy glass door shut behind him. I did not even have the chance to fully outline my counteroffensive before a sharp, aggressive commotion erupted in the outer reception area. I looked up through the glass partitions of my corner office. My receptionist, Elena, was standing up behind her marble desk, holding her hands out in a clear attempt to block someone from entering the executive suite. The person shoving past her with absolutely zero regard for professional boundaries was my brother. Jamal looked entirely unhinged. The perfectly tailored, effortless aesthetic he usually paraded around the country club had completely evaporated. His expensive Italian suit jacket was unbuttoned and wrinkled. His silk tie was pulled loose, hanging haphazardly around his neck, and a sheen of frantic, greasy sweat coated his forehead. He shoved the heavy glass door to my office open with so much force that the hinges groaned in protest. I am so sorry, Miss Holloway, Elena said, her voice breathless. He just barged right through the security doors. I can call building security immediately. I raised a single hand, keeping my posture perfectly relaxed, in my high-backed leather chair. It is fine, Elena, I replied smoothly. My brother was just leaving. Give us exactly 5 minutes, and if he is not back on the elevator by then, you can have security escort him off the premises. Elena nodded curtly, shooting Jamal a look of pure disdain before pulling the door shut, leaving the two of us sealed inside the soundproof room. Jamal did not waste a single second. He marched directly up to my desk, slammed his hands flat against the polished mahogany, and leaned over, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me. He threw a single crumpled document directly onto my keyboard. "Sign it!" he demanded, his voice ragged and breathless, like he had just sprinted up 5 flights of stairs. I did not even flinch. I slowly lowered my gaze to the piece of paper. It was a standard legal waiver, hastily drafted and lacking any formal corporate letterhead. The language was blunt and desperate. It was a complete relinquishment of any and all rights claims and ownership stakes regarding the Holloway Enterprises Trust, and all associated land deeds, transferring them unconditionally back to Jeremiah Sterling and Jamal Sterling. I looked back up at my brother. I did not say a word. I simply let the silence stretch, forcing him to stew in his own frantic energy. "Are you deaf?" Zuri, Jamal barked, slamming his fist against the desk again. "I said sign the paper. You have had your fun. You threw your little temper tantrum at the country club and you embarrassed Mom in front of half the city. But the game is over. Dad just filed a massive competency lawsuit against Grandpa. You are completely outmatched." He paced back and forth in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows, running a shaking hand over his closely cropped hair. He was trying to project dominance, but the raw, unadulterated fear rolling off him in waves was palpable. He smelled of stale scotch and expensive, stress-tinged cologne. "You really think you can run a commercial real estate holding company?" Jamal scoffed, stopping to point a trembling finger at my face. "You are just a glorified accountant, Zuri. You manage mutual funds for bored rich widows. You do not know how the real world works. You do not know how to handle multi-million-dollar leverage. You are playing in a league you cannot even begin to comprehend." I folded my hands neatly on top of my desk. The sheer arrogance of his entitlement was staggering. Here was a man who had secretly bankrupted his own future, standing in the office of a self-made executive, calling her a glorified accountant. "If you do not sign that waiver right now," Jamal continued, his voice dropping into a malicious, threatening sneer. Dad is going to ruin you in court. He is going to drag your name through the mud. He is going to expose every single detail of your pathetic, lonely life to the press. He will freeze every asset tied to the Holloway name, and he will bankrupt your little firm in legal fees before the judge even hears the opening arguments. Sign the paper, Zuri. Do not make us destroy you. His chest was heaving. He was terrified, grasping at every manipulative tactic he had ever used to get his way. I slowly leaned back in my chair, uncrossing my legs. As I did, I brought my left hand up to rest casually against my right wrist. With a subtle practice motion, I tapped the face of my smartwatch twice, activating the high-fidelity voice memo recording feature. The screen flashed a tiny red dot completely hidden from his line of sight. If Dad's lawsuit is such an ironclad guarantee, Jamal, I said, my voice dangerously soft. And even then, why exactly are you standing in my office, sweating through a $3,000 suit, begging me to sign a worthless piece of paper? Jamal froze. His jaw worked silently for a moment, before he managed to speak. I am not begging. I am offering you a way out. I am trying to save you from absolute financial ruin. You are trying to save yourself, Jamal, I countered, keeping my tone conversational, as if we were discussing the weather rather than federal crimes. Because a competency lawsuit takes months to litigate. Even with an emergency injunction, probate court is a painfully slow process. The land deeds will be frozen in legal limbo while the court evaluates Grandpa's mental state. And a frozen asset cannot be sold, transferred, or used to satisfy an impending debt. Jamal's eyes darted wildly around the room, avoiding my gaze. I do not know what you are talking about. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk, closing the physical distance between us. Let us stop pretending, I whispered, delivering the final fatal blow. How exactly are you planning to cover a $25 million balloon payment to Obsidian Equity Partners in 10 days using a frozen asset? All the blood instantly drained from Jamal's face. He looked as if he had just been physically struck. His mouth fell open and he stumbled backward, his legs hitting the edge of one of my leather guest chairs. He practically collapsed into it, staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. How? Jamal stammered, his voice dropping to a terrified, breathless whisper. How do you know that name? Because I own the holding company, Jamal. I replied, locking my eyes onto his panicked gaze. I own the master ledgers. I spent the entire night reading your incredibly sloppy, deeply illegal tax filings. You leveraged land you never owned to borrow shadow money for a commercial district that the city condemned. You cannot prove I signed those deeds. Jamal blurted out, the panic entirely overriding any remaining shred of his common sense. The broker at Obsidian verified the collateral. You cannot prove I falsified Grandpa's signature. It was an internal corporate transfer. I sat perfectly still, letting his absolute, undeniable confession record directly into the microphone on my wrist. He had just admitted to forging the deeds and actively deceiving a private equity group. He had practically gift-wrapped a federal wire fraud indictment and handed it directly to me. Obsidian Equity will not care about a competency lawsuit, Jamal, I said, driving the reality of his situation directly into his chest. They do not care about Jeremiah's country club connections or Ashley's crying videos. They are shadow lenders. They want their $25 million by next Friday. If you default, they will seize the dealerships. And when they realize the collateral was forged, they are going to call the federal authorities. Jamal leaped up from the guest chair, his movements entirely erratic. He grabbed the unsigned waiver off my desk, crumpling it in his fist. He was breathing heavily, pacing like a caged, terrified animal, realizing the walls were closing in. He looked at the heavy glass door, then back at me, his face twisting into a mask of pure, desperate hatred. You think you are so smart! He screamed, his voice cracking violently, completely abandoning any remaining pretense of control. You think you have me backed into a corner. You do not know anything. It does not matter what you found in those ledgers. He backed away toward the exit, pointing the crumpled ball of paper at my face. Dad already fixed it. Jamal yelled, his voice echoing off the soundproof walls. He found a private investor. We are getting a massive cash injection by Friday. We are paying off Obsidian Equity in full before the balloon deadline even hits. Your little land grab is totally useless, Zuri. We are going to wipe the debt clean, and then we are going to bury you. He spun around, yanked the heavy glass door open, and stormed out into the reception area. I watched through the glass partitions as he practically sprinted toward the elevators, leaving a trail of stunned, whispering employees in his wake. I sat in the sudden, absolute silence of my office. I slowly brought my left wrist up, tapped the screen of my smartwatch, and stopped the recording. The audio file saved securely to my encrypted cloud drive. I looked at the empty space where my brother had just been standing. A slow, deeply genuine smile spread across my face. A private investor. Jeremiah Sterling had somehow managed to locate a private investor willing to drop $25 million in liquid cash to cover a fraudulent shadow loan in less than a week. It was an act of supreme, staggering desperation. And it was exactly the opening I needed. I picked up my desk phone and dialed my lead broker's extension. Marcus answered on the first ring. "Marcus," I said, my voice sharp, authoritative, and completely devoid of fear. "I need you to mobilize our entire intelligence team immediately. I want a full comprehensive sweep of every single private equity firm, venture capital group, and independent angel investor operating within a 500-mile radius of Atlanta. Jeremiah Sterling is trying to secure a $25 million emergency bailout before Friday. Find out exactly who he is talking to." I paused, my eyes drifting toward the Atlanta skyline stretching out beyond my windows. "Find out who they are," I instructed smoothly, "because I am going to buy them out before Jeremiah even gets the chance to sign the paperwork." By Wednesday morning, the suffocating tension that had gripped the Atlanta business elite began to shift into a manic, buzzing energy. Jeremiah Sterling had never been a man capable of quiet victories. He required an audience. He required applause. He required the world to know that he was untouchable. He immediately started leaking the news to his preferred contacts at the Atlanta Business Chronicle before the ink on his term sheets was even fully dry. The headlines practically wrote themselves, appearing on the digital screens of every wealth manager and real estate developer in the city. Sterling Auto Empire secures massive private equity buyout to complete downtown expansion. He was deliberately painting himself as a visionary titan of industry, who had effortlessly weathered a minor corporate storm. He was taking a victory lap right through the center of Buckhead, entirely convinced that his legacy was secure. Jamal, completely insulated by our father's desperate blind protection, returned to his usual haunts with terrifying speed. My intelligence team reported that he was spotted at Bones Restaurant on consecutive nights, ordering extravagant bottles of Louis XIII cognac. He was loudly bragging to anyone who would listen that his commercial district was back on track and bigger than ever. He genuinely believed he had outmaneuvered the consequences of a $25 million federal crime. The sheer staggering delusion required to operate at that level of arrogance while standing on a trapdoor was almost fascinating to watch. They thought they had found a lifeline. They thought they had completely bypassed my grandfather's authority and my newfound leverage. My private cell phone vibrated violently against the polished wood of my desk, shattering the quiet focus of my office. The screen illuminated, displaying a notification from a group chat titled Sterling Family. It was a digital space I had kept muted for over 2 years. It was an arena entirely dedicated to my mother planning highly orchestrated holiday photo shoots, and my father dropping passive-aggressive links to articles about dutiful children working in family businesses. I slowly picked up the phone. The messages were coming in rapid succession. The first message was from Jeremiah. It did not contain a greeting. It was stripped of any familial warmth, reading like a corporate cease and desist letter, mixed with the petty, unhinged gloating of a schoolyard bully. "We just secured funding. Your little stunt with Grandpa failed. We are closing the deal tomorrow morning. You thought you could use a confused old man to steal what belongs to Jamal, but you fundamentally underestimated who I am in this city. You are nothing without us, Zuri. You have always been nothing without this family backing you up." Before I could even process the sheer breathtaking audacity of his words, a second message populated the screen. It was from Valerie. As always, my mother eagerly played the role of the benevolent, deeply wounded peacekeeper, wielding her maternal status like a bludgeon. Zuri, despite the terrible pain you have caused us this week, we are still your parents. We are holding a major press conference at the flagship showroom on Friday at noon to announce the new private equity partnership. Please come to the press conference on Friday. We want to show the community our family is united. We are willing to let the past go if you can just be a team player for once. Wear the beige suit, it softens your features. I sat in my quiet office staring at the glowing screen. The psychological warfare was executed flawlessly. It was a perfectly designed, deeply toxic trap. Valerie and Jeremiah knew exactly how the Atlanta elite operated. If I refused to attend the press conference, the whispered narrative would solidify immediately. I would be cast as the bitter, jealous daughter hiding in shame because my attempted corporate coup had failed miserably. My absence would be weaponized as absolute proof of my guilt. If I did attend, however, I would be utilized as a silent, defeated prop. I would be forced to stand behind Jeremiah and Jamal smiling for the cameras while they announced their triumphant victory. I would be a visual endorsement of the very men who were actively trying to destroy my grandfather's legacy. They wanted me on a leash, publicly displaying my submission to the sterling patriarchy. They wanted to prove to the society wives and the country club executives that Valerie was the magnanimous matriarch who graciously forgave her jealous, wayward daughter. I tapped the reply field. I did not type out a defense. I did not try to justify my actions or engage with Jeremiah's insults. I did not react to Valerie's toxic conditional olive branch. I kept my face entirely impassive, my thumbs moving swiftly across the digital keyboard. I will be there. I would not miss it for the world. I hit send and immediately locked the screen, tossing the phone face down onto my desk. The war of public perception was irrelevant to me now. They were fighting over optics, but I was fighting for absolute ownership. I picked up my secure encrypted office line and dialed a number that did not route through my firm's standard switchboard. The call bounced through 3 different international servers before connecting to a private office in Geneva. Elias, my lead offshore asset manager, answered on the second ring. I leaned back in my chair and asked him for a status update. Elias's voice was crisp, efficient, and deeply satisfying. He confirmed that our aggressive, highly covert operational sweep had been a complete success. When Jeremiah panicked, he had cast a massive net into the private equity sector, desperate for any firm willing to hand over $30 million to cover the shadow loan and fund the immediate operational deficit. He was bleeding and he needed a tourniquet fast. My firm had easily intercepted the financial distress signals. Acting under the shield of a newly formed, heavily obscured shell corporation named Apex Global Holdings, Elias had approached Jeremiah with an offer that looked like a miracle. Apex Global offered to buy out the toxic $25 million note from Obsidian Equity Partners and inject an additional $5 million in working capital into the dealership. Jeremiah was so blinded by his own desperation and his desperate need to protect Jamal from federal prison that he did not order a deep forensic audit of his new benefactors. He simply looked at the capital on the table and signed the term sheets. But the new terms were completely merciless. To secure the $30 million bailout, Jeremiah had been forced to pledge the last remaining clean assets he possessed. He had pledged the operational licenses, the physical inventory, and the brand trademark of the Sterling Auto Empire as collateral to Apex Global. Elias confirmed that the wire transfers had cleared. He confirmed that the mountain of paperwork had been heavily vetted, signed, and legally sealed in international escrow. He confirmed that Obsidian Equity, the ruthless shadow lenders holding Jamal's forged deeds, had been more than happy to sell the dirty debt for a slight premium. Jeremiah and Jamal believed they were signing their lives over to a faceless, aggressive international holding company. They thought they had found a ruthless, well-funded partner who cared only about the profit margins of their downtown commercial expansion. They thought they had successfully outmaneuvered me, securing the capital needed to wipe away Jamal's felony and keep their pristine reputation intact. They had absolutely no idea that I was the sole unmitigated owner of Apex Global Holdings. I thanked Elias for his impeccable work and disconnected the call. The silence in my office felt electric, humming with a kinetic, undeniable power. My grandfather had handed me the deeds to the physical earth their empire stood on. Now, through Apex Global, I had just legally acquired the debt that controlled their operational licenses, their inventory, and their entire brand identity. Jeremiah had spent the entire week mocking my position. He had called me a glorified accountant. He had threatened to crush my firm and drag my grandfather's mental competency through the mud of the Fulton County Superior Court. He had demanded my submission, ordering me to a press conference to act as a prop for his victory lap. He eagerly signed a contract tying his entire financial existence to a corporate entity he knew absolutely nothing about. He had signed away his freedom, his leverage, and his legacy. I stood up, walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, and looked out over the sprawling, sunlit expanse of Atlanta. The Sterling family thought Friday was going to be a celebration of their resilience. They thought they were going to stand at a podium, look into the flashing cameras, and announce their triumphant return to the top of the food chain. They wanted a show. I was fully prepared to give them a masterpiece. I did not sleep for the next 48 hours. My wealth management firm seamlessly transformed from a traditional advisory suite into an absolute militarized war room. While Jeremiah and Jamal were busy popping expensive champagne at their exclusive country clubs, prematurely celebrating a victory they had not yet officially secured, my crisis management team was dissecting their financial carcass with surgical precision. Elias and my intelligence division mapped out the exact corporate structure of Obsidian Equity Partners. Obsidian was known in the industry as a ruthless shadow lender, but they were also notoriously risk-averse when it came to direct federal scrutiny. The second my team utilized a secure offshore proxy to anonymously leak a heavily redacted dossier hinting at a pending federal investigation into the forged Holloway land deeds, the executives at Obsidian panicked. They realized they were holding a $25 million toxic asset secured by completely fraudulent collateral. They wanted to wash their hands of the entire Sterling family mess before the federal authorities came knocking with subpoenas and asset freezes. That was the exact moment Apex Global Holdings stepped out of the shadows. Operating entirely through a labyrinth of Swiss servers and offshore holding accounts, I authorized Elias to make Obsidian Equity a direct, non-negotiable buyout offer. I utilized the liquid capital my grandfather had legally transferred to me through Holloway Enterprises. I did not offer them $25 million. I offered them exactly $8 million in clean, immediately accessible, untraceable cash to walk away from the debt entirely. Obsidian took the massive loss just to scrub the criminal liability from their corporate ledgers. I bought my family's financial execution for absolute pennies on the dollar. But purchasing the toxic debt was only the first phase of the strategy. Jeremiah still needed immediate operational capital to keep his legitimate dealerships afloat after bleeding their accounts dry to cover Jamal's previous exorbitant interest payments. So, acting as Apex Global, my firm extended an incredibly generous expedited restructuring offer directly to Jeremiah Sterling. We offered to assume the initial debt and inject an additional $5 million in immediate liquid cash to save his failing empire. Jeremiah was so completely blinded by his own arrogance and his desperate clawing need to protect his golden boy from federal prison that he rushed the paperwork through his legal team in less than a single business day. He never bothered to order a forensic audit of his new benefactors. He never demanded to look behind the corporate curtain of Apex Global. He simply saw a pile of cash large enough to hide his son's felony, and he blindly signed his name on the dotted line. I sat at my polished mahogany desk as the sun set over the Atlanta skyline, tracing my index finger over the digital signatures on the finalized countersigned term sheets. The absolute magnitude of what I had just legally acquired was staggering. The new Apex Global contract contained a comprehensive ironclad cross-collateralization clause. Jeremiah thought he was securing a standard commercial real estate bailout. In reality, to guarantee that $5 million cash injection he had signed over absolutely everything. I pulled up the itemized asset list on my monitor, reading through the inventory with a cold, detached satisfaction. I now held the master liens on every single Sterling Auto Empire dealership in the state of Georgia. I owned their operational licenses, the commercial lots their showrooms sat on, and the millions of dollars in physical vehicle inventory parked on their asphalt. If they defaulted on a single provision or missed a single payment by a fraction of a second, I had the immediate legal authority to liquidate the entire fleet of luxury vehicles and shutter their doors permanently. But the true, undeniable masterpiece of the acquisition was the personal guarantees. Jeremiah had been so fiercely certain of his ultimate success, so convinced that his downtown commercial expansion would eventually yield billions, that he had leveraged his own personal assets to push the deal through. I now held the primary mortgage on Jeremiah and Valerie's sprawling 10,000 square foot estate in Buckhead. I held the deed to Jamal's luxury downtown penthouse. They had literally mortgaged the roofs over their heads to a faceless shell corporation. They thought they had brilliantly outsmarted me. They thought that stripping me of my inheritance and publicly humiliating me at the country club would leave me powerless and obedient. Instead, my father and my brother had legally bound themselves to me in chains of their own making. I was no longer just the estranged, disappointing daughter. I was their bank. I was their landlord. I was the absolute dictator of their financial survival. Every single time my mother hosted a society luncheon in her perfectly manicured gardens, she would be standing on grass that belonged entirely to me. As the week crawled toward Friday, the contrast between my silent, lethal preparations and my family's loud, ignorant gloating became almost comical. They were entirely convinced they had won the war, and they wanted to make sure I felt the sting of my defeat. The family group chat remained a constant buzzing stream of self-congratulatory messages. Jeremiah sent a text on Thursday evening that radiated pure, unchecked ego. "We just secured funding. Your little stunt with Grandpa failed miserably. We are closing the deal tomorrow morning. You thought you could use a confused old man to steal what belongs to Jamal, but you fundamentally underestimated who I am in this city. You are nothing without us, Zuri." Seconds later, Valerie chimed in eagerly, playing her role as the benevolent, deeply wounded peacekeeper. "Zuri, despite the terrible pain you have caused us this week, we are still your parents. We are holding a major press conference at the flagship showroom on Friday at noon to announce the new private equity partnership. Please come to the press conference. We want to show the community our family is united. We are willing to let the past go if you can just be a team player for once. Wear the beige suit, it softens your features." The psychological warfare was executed flawlessly. It was a perfectly designed, deeply toxic trap. Valerie and Jeremiah were inviting me to my own public execution. If I refused to attend, the whispered narrative among the elite would solidify immediately. I would be cast as the bitter, jealous daughter hiding in shame. If I did attend, I would be utilized as a silent, defeated prop forced to smile for the cameras while they announced their triumphant victory. The most pathetic display, however, came from Ashley. My sister-in-law had clearly been assured that their financial nightmare was permanently over. She immediately returned to her favorite weapon of choice, social media. Throughout Wednesday and Thursday, my intelligence team monitored her Instagram accounts. She posted a series of highly produced soft-focus videos of herself and Jamal clinking crystal champagne flutes at an exclusive rooftop restaurant. The captions were dripping with passive-aggressive venom designed specifically for me to see. One post featured a selfie of Ashley looking wistfully into the camera, with the text, "God always removes toxic people from your life to make room for incredible blessings." Another showed Jamal stepping into a brand new sports car, captioned, "When you stay true to your family legacy, the universe rewards you." The hate is just background noise to our success. I watched the digital circus from the absolute silence of my office. I did not feel a single ounce of anger. I felt nothing but a cold, surgical precision. They were decorating a house that was already engulfed in flames. They were celebrating a rescue boat that was actually a submarine. I let them enjoy their champagne. I let them bask in the temporary illusion of total victory. The higher they built their pedestal of arrogance, the more devastating the impact would be when I finally kicked the supports out from under them. I tapped the reply field in the family group chat. I did not type out a defense. I did not try to justify my actions or engage with Jeremiah's insults. I kept my face entirely impassive, my thumbs moving swiftly across the digital keyboard. I will be there. I would not miss it for the world. Friday morning arrived with a crisp, clear blue sky over Atlanta. The day of the press conference. The day Jeremiah Sterling intended to announce his triumphant partnership with Apex Global Holdings to the entire business community, the local press, and the elite families of Buckhead. I stood in the center of my master bedroom, evaluating my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. Valerie had explicitly requested that I wear a soft beige suit. She wanted me to look subdued, agreeable, and appropriately chastened. She wanted a prop that blended into the background while the Sterling men commanded the stage. I reached into my closet and bypassed the beige entirely. I selected a tailored razor-sharp suit in a deep, unforgiving shade of charcoal black. The cut was aggressive and commanding, paired with a crimson silk blouse that radiated absolute authority rather than submission. I fastened my grandfather's vintage gold watch around my wrist, a silent, heavy tribute to the man whose legacy I was actively protecting. Just as I finished adjusting the cuffs of my jacket, my phone vibrated on the vanity. The screen illuminated with a secure, encrypted text message. It was from Grandpa Josiah. Despite Jeremiah's fraudulent legal claims of dementia and severe cognitive decline, my grandfather's mind remained as sharp and ruthless as the day he built Holloway Enterprises. He knew exactly what was happening today. He knew exactly what I had accomplished with the capital he entrusted to me. I opened the message. It contained only 5 words. Give them hell, baby girl. A slow, predatory smile touched the corners of my mouth. I slipped the phone into my leather briefcase alongside the master copies of the Apex Global Acquisition contracts. I picked up my car keys and walked out the door. Jeremiah and Valerie thought they were hosting a celebration of their corporate brilliance. They had invited the press, the politicians, and their country club peers to witness their magnificent resurrection. It was time to walk into their showroom and attend a funeral disguised as a celebration. The grand ballroom of the St. Regis Atlanta was bathed in the warm, golden glow of tiered crystal chandeliers. It was a space designed exclusively for displays of immense power and wealth, and my family had effectively rented the entire floor to broadcast their survival. As I walked through the heavy mahogany doors, the ambient noise of clinking champagne flutes and networking executives hit me like a physical wave. The Sterling family public relations team had clearly been working overtime. Every major local news affiliate had a camera tripod set up in the back of the room. The mayor's deputy chief of staff was lingering near the open bar. Several prominent commercial real estate developers, the exact people Jeremiah needed to impress to validate his downtown expansion, were clustered in small groups exchanging hushed gossip. I did not slip into the room quietly. I wanted them to see me. I wanted every single person who had watched Ashley's manufactured crying videos or heard the rumors about my grandfather's competency lawsuit to look directly at me. The charcoal black suit and crimson silk blouse commanded immediate attention. I moved with a slow, deliberate grace, my leather briefcase gripped firmly in my left hand. I saw heads turn. I saw the whispered conversations halt and pivot in my direction. The narrative circulating through Buckhead was that I was a disgraced, bitter daughter who had tried and failed to usurp her family's throne. I was supposed to be hiding in shame. Instead, I was walking through their celebration like I owned the building. I did not even make it to the velvet ropes separating the media from the guest seating before she intercepted me. Valerie moved through the crowd with the frantic, highly calibrated speed of a woman terrified of losing control. She wore a pristine pearl-white dress, her hair perfectly styled to project the image of a serene, magnanimous matriarch. But up close, the facade was cracking. The muscles in her neck were tight, and her eyes darted nervously toward the press cameras to ensure no one was recording our interaction. She stepped directly into my path, forcing me to stop. She reached out and grabbed my forearm, her manicured nails digging sharply through the wool sleeve of my jacket. She maintained a terrifyingly bright, photogenic smile for the room, but her voice was a toxic, venomous hiss entirely meant for me. "Don't you dare embarrass us today," she whispered, her words clipping together with panicked urgency. "We are giving you a chance to be part of this family again. Do not ruin this for your brother. Keep your mouth shut, keep your head down, and sit in the back." I stopped. I looked down at the hand digging into my arm, and then I looked up into my mother's eyes. I did not argue with her. I did not defend my presence. I did not waste a single breath trying to explain that the men she was protecting were currently standing on a financial trapdoor. I simply maintained a cold, completely impassive stare, radiating an absolute void of emotion. I pulled my arm free with a fluid, dismissive motion that required no physical effort at all. I brushed right past her without speaking a single word. I ignored the rows of folding chairs set up in the back for extended family and dealership managers. I walked straight down the center aisle, feeling the collective gaze of the Atlanta business elite burning into my back. I approached the very front row. These seats were sectioned off by a thick silk cord. The chairs were plush, and resting on the seat cushions were heavy gold-embossed placards that read, "Reserved for VIP investors, Apex Global Holdings." The young public relations coordinator standing near the stage took a step forward, her eyes widening in panic, as I ducked gracefully under the silk cord. She opened her mouth to tell me I was in the wrong section, but I shot her a look of such absolute freezing authority that she immediately stepped back and lowered her clipboard. I took my seat directly in the center of the VIP section. I placed my leather briefcase carefully on my lap and crossed my legs. A heavy, incredibly tense murmur rippled through the rows behind me. They all knew who I was, and they all knew I had absolutely no business sitting in the seats reserved for the corporate saviors of the Sterling Auto Empire. I stared straight ahead at the empty podium. 5 minutes later, the ballroom lights dimmed. A hush fell over the crowd as a sleek, professionally produced video montage began playing on the massive screens flanking the stage. It showcased aerial shots of the Sterling dealership's architectural renderings of Jamal's downtown commercial district, and vintage photographs of my grandfather standing in front of his very first car lot. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation, perfectly designed to frame Jeremiah and Jamal as the rightful inheritors of a magnificent legacy. When the video faded, Jeremiah Sterling walked onto the stage. The applause was loud and immediate. My father practically glowed under the stage lights. He wore a custom-tailored navy suit, projecting the aura of a man who had never experienced a single moment of doubt in his entire life. He stepped up to the acrylic podium, gripping the edges with large, confident hands, and smiled out at the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, and members of the press." Jeremiah began, his deep, resonant voice filling the ballroom perfectly. "The Sterling legacy is built on bedrock. For over 40 years, this family has stood as a pillar of the Atlanta business community. We have weathered economic downturns, shifting markets, and moments of profound uncertainty. But true leadership is not defined by the absence of storms. True leadership is defined by the ability to navigate those storms and emerge stronger, more united, and more ambitious than ever before." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the crowd. He was in his absolute element. "When we announced our plans for the downtown commercial expansion, there were skeptics." Jeremiah continued, his tone shifting into something fiercely proud. "People told us the scope was too large. People told us the timing was wrong. But we knew that this project was not just about real estate. It is about resilience. It is about Black excellence. It is about building generational wealth and leaving a permanent, undeniable mark on the city that made us who we are." He turned his head and gestured toward the side of the stage. "And no one embodies the future of that vision more than my son, the Vice President of Operations, Jamal Sterling." Jamal walked onto the stage to another round of enthusiastic applause. He looked incredibly smug, the frantic, sweating mess of a man who had barged into my office earlier that week was completely gone, replaced by the arrogant, entitled Prince of Buckhead. He stood shoulder to shoulder with our father, grinning at the crowd. He scanned the front rows, and his eyes locked onto mine. He saw me sitting in the VIP investor section, and a momentary look of confusion crossed his face, quickly followed by a mocking, condescending smirk. He truly believed I was sitting there as a pathetic act of rebellion, a desperate cry for attention from a woman who had already lost the war. I held his gaze. I did not blink. I let my hand rest lightly against the leather handle of my briefcase. I owned the debt on his penthouse. I owned the operating licenses to the dealership he was standing in. I owned the very stage he was currently using to declare his victory. This project requires capital. Yes. Jeremiah continued, his voice booming over the sound system. But more importantly, it requires partners who share our vision. It requires investors who recognize the unshakable value of the Sterling brand. This week, we finalized a historic partnership. We have secured a massive, comprehensive buyout of our initial development loans and an enormous injection of working capital that will allow us to complete the downtown district ahead of schedule. The press cameras flashed rapidly. The reporters leaned forward, pens hovering over their notepads. "We are not just surviving, we are expanding," Jeremiah declared, raising his voice to a triumphant crescendo. "And we could not have done it without a private equity firm that saw our true potential." Ladies and gentlemen, it is my profound honor to invite the managing partner of Apex Global Holdings to the stage to formalize this historic acquisition. The audience began to applaud. Jeremiah stepped back from the podium, gesturing grandly toward the aisle where I was sitting, waiting for a faceless corporate executive to walk down and shake his hand. Right as the applause swelled, I felt a sudden movement to my right. The empty chair next to me groaned slightly as someone slid into it. I smelled the heavy, cloying scent of expensive floral perfume before I even turned my head. It was Ashley. My sister-in-law leaned in close, completely ignoring the fact that Jeremiah was actively calling for the investor to take the stage. She clearly could not resist the opportunity to twist the knife one final time. She leaned so close that her lips practically brushed the shell of my ear, her voice dropping into a venomous, deeply satisfied whisper. "I told you God removes toxic people to make room for blessings, Zuri. You tried to ruin my husband, and now you have to sit here and watch him win. You are completely irrelevant." Ashley crossed her legs, smoothing the fabric of her designer dress with a hand that was entirely too heavy with diamond rings. She projected the absolute picture of a supportive, adoring family member for the cameras situated at the back of the room. She kept her face angled perfectly toward the stage, wearing a bright, entirely manufactured smile as Jeremiah continued to pontificate about the Sterling legacy. But the moment her lips stopped moving for the photographers, her entire demeanor shifted. The sweet, innocent, victimized persona she had so carefully cultivated on social media evaporated instantly. She leaned closer to me, the suffocating scent of her expensive floral perfume masking the absolute venom radiating from her. "We won, Zuri," she whispered, her voice a sharp, grating hiss that was completely at odds with her radiant smile. "You really thought you could outsmart us, did you not? You thought taking advantage of a confused old man and hiding behind his trust fund would actually make you powerful. But look at where you are sitting. You are in the front row of our victory party." I did not turn my head to look at her. I kept my gaze fixed on the stage, watching my father gesture grandly to the crowd. I allowed a fraction of a second to pass, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her uncomfortable. Ashley leaned in even closer, her shoulder brushing against mine. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance pouring off her was almost intoxicating. She was entirely convinced that she was holding the winning hand. "Just sign the waiver." "Releasing Grandpa's estate," Ashley demanded, her tone dropping into a condescending, patronizing sneer. "Do it today quietly, without any more of your pathetic public tantrums. If you just sign the land back over to Jamal where it belongs, we will throw you 100 grand so your little firm does not go under. It is a generous offer, Zuri. Take the money and go back to your boring, invisible life before my husband absolutely destroys whatever tiny reputation you have left in this city." The audacity of her offer was genuinely magnificent. $100,000. They had just signed away their operational licenses, their commercial real estate, and the mortgages on their personal mansions to a shadow corporation to cover a $25 million felony, and Ashley was sitting next to me, offering $100,000 as if she were dispensing charity to a beggar. I knew exactly what this moment required. I needed her to feel completely dominant. I needed her to believe that her psychological warfare had broken my spirit. I let out a long, slow breath, purposefully allowing my shoulders to slump. I lowered my gaze to the polished leather of my briefcase resting on my lap. I arranged my facial features into a mask of exhausted defeat, biting the inside of my cheek to keep from smiling. "I just do not understand," I whispered, keeping my voice small, fragile, and entirely devoid of the icy confidence I had carried into the room. "I spent days reviewing those files, Ashley. I saw the numbers. The commercial district was completely stalled. The city had condemned the properties. Jamal had absolutely zero incoming revenue to show for that project." I turned my head slightly, looking at her with wide, defeated eyes. I played the role of the bewildered, outmatched sister to absolute perfection. "How did he do it?" I asked, letting a tremor of genuine-sounding awe slip into my voice. How did Jamal manage to secure such a massive $25 million loan from Obsidian Equity in the first place? Shadow lenders at that level are completely ruthless. They demand ironclad collateral. They demand impeccable guarantors. I just do not understand how he got them to approve the initial capital without exposing the entire dealership network to extreme risk. Ashley practically vibrated with smug satisfaction. She took the bait so completely, so effortlessly, that it was almost entirely pathetic. She looked at me the way a predator looks at a wounded animal, eager to demonstrate exactly how far out of my depth I truly was. She wanted to prove Jamal's absolute superiority. She wanted to rub my face in his supposed business genius. "Because Jamal is a visionary, Zuri," Ashley whispered fiercely, a cruel, triumphant light dancing in her eyes. "He does not sit around waiting for permission like you do. He takes initiative." The project was hemorrhaging money, and Jeremiah was moving too slow. He was dragging his feet, complaining about liquidity and market timing. Jamal knew the expansion was a guaranteed goldmine, so he did what a real leader does. He secured the funding himself. She let out a soft, mocking laugh, shaking her head at my apparent ignorance. Obsidian Equity required a primary corporate guarantor. She continued, leaning even closer, entirely eager to boast about her husband's ruthless tactics. They needed the signature of the sitting CEO to authorize that level of institutional leverage. But Jeremiah was out of town at a banking conference, and the deadline to secure the construction permits was closing in. So Jamal did what he had to do to save the family vision. He signed Jeremiah's name on the primary guarantor documents. He forged his own father's signature to get the initial capital, and it worked flawlessly. He got the $25 million, he kept the project breathing, and nobody was the wiser. That is what it takes to build an empire, Zuri. You have to be willing to do whatever it takes. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the absolute staggering magnitude of the confession she had just voluntarily handed me. Jamal had not just forged my grandfather's signature on the physical land deeds. He had forged Jeremiah's signature on the corporate guarantee. He had committed double federal fraud. He had actively, intentionally set his own father up to take the entire legal and financial fall if Obsidian Equity ever decided to call in the loan. Jeremiah was currently standing on a stage giving a passionate, booming speech about family loyalty, Black excellence, and leaving a legacy for his son, completely unaware that his beloved golden boy had committed a federal crime in his name. The poetic justice of the situation was almost overwhelmingly beautiful. Jeremiah had spent his entire life favoring Jamal, elevating him, protecting him, and dismissing me. And Jamal had repaid that blind loyalty by forging his father's signature to secure shadow money from predatory lenders. I slowly sat up straight. The manufactured slump in my shoulders vanished. The carefully constructed mask of fragile defeat instantly dissolved, replaced by a cold, surgical composure. I unclasped my hands from my lap, reached into the pocket of my tailored blazer, and pulled out my smartphone. I held the device up so that the screen was perfectly visible to Ashley. The high-fidelity voice recording app was actively running the red digital timer, ticking away the seconds. The audio waveform pulsed sharply, capturing the ambient noise of the ballroom and the direct, undeniable echo of her confession. I tapped the screen once. The recording stopped. I pressed save, ensuring the audio file was instantly uploaded to my encrypted offshore cloud server. I turned my head and looked directly into Ashley's eyes. My voice was no longer a fragile whisper. It was a razor blade, cold and completely merciless. "You really should read the contracts your husband signs, Ashley," I said evenly. The transformation in her face was spectacular. The smug, triumphant sneer melted off her features in a fraction of a second. All the blood drained from her perfectly contoured cheeks, leaving her looking entirely hollow and physically sick. Her eyes darted from my smartphone to my face, wide with sudden, unadulterated terror. She opened her mouth to speak, to demand I delete the file, to somehow retract the confession she had just proudly delivered, but her vocal cords completely failed her. She could only sit there, paralyzed by the sudden realization that she had just handed me the weapon required to put her husband in a federal penitentiary. Before she could even attempt to recover, the booming, amplified voice of my father echoed through the ballroom speakers, commanding the absolute attention of every single person in the room. "This buyout is not just a financial transaction," Jeremiah declared, his voice radiating profound pride and unshakable confidence. "It is a testament to the enduring strength of the sterling name. We have found a partner who recognizes our true value. A partner who understands that our family does not retreat when faced with adversity. We expand, we conquer, and we build for the future, and we..." The crowd began to murmur with anticipation. The flashing of the press cameras intensified, illuminating the stage in rapid bursts of brilliant white light. And now, Jeremiah announced, raising his hands toward the VIP section where I was sitting, "I would like to invite the visionary leader who made this historic expansion possible. Please join me in welcoming the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Global Holdings to the stage." The ballroom erupted into polite, expectant applause. Jeremiah stepped back from the acrylic podium. His chest puffed out, an enormous, welcoming smile plastered across his face. He extended his right hand toward the center aisle, waiting to greet his corporate savior. He was waiting for a nameless, faceless executive to walk out of the shadows and validate his entire existence. Ashley sat frozen in the chair next to me, her breathing shallow and erratic. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a dawning catastrophic horror. I smoothed the lapels of my charcoal black suit. I picked up my leather briefcase, my grip firm and completely steady. I stood up. I smoothed the pristine fabric of my charcoal suit, every movement deliberate and measured. I did not look back at Ashley. She was already a ghost, a casualty of her own profound ignorance, suffocating on the toxic reality of her confession. I stepped out of the VIP row and planted my heels directly in the center of the plush-patterned carpet of the main aisle. The polite, expectant applause that had been swelling in the ballroom suddenly fractured. It did not stop all at once, but rather died out in ragged, confused waves. The society wives, the real estate developers, and the local politicians followed my movement, their hands slowing to a hesitant halt. A low, kinetic murmur began to ripple through the sea of seated guests. The whispers ignited like dry brush catching fire. The elite families of Atlanta thrived on scandal, but they preferred it kept behind the closed doors of their manicured estates. To see a disruption of this magnitude occurring in the pristine ballroom of the St. Regis was completely unprecedented. As I took my first step toward the stage, the murmurs escalated into a frantic buzzing, and then as the sheer, undeniable authority of my stride registered with the crowd, the noise evaporated completely. The room plunged into a dead, suffocating silence. The only sound left in the massive space was the rhythmic, predatory click of my heels against the floorboards. On the stage, the triumphant smiles plastered across the faces of my father and brother began to curdle. Jeremiah squinted against the glaring heat of the stage lights, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. He had explicitly invited the chief executive officer of Apex Global Holdings to join him. He expected a silver-haired, blue-blooded financier to walk down that aisle and shake his hand. Seeing his scapegoat daughter, the woman he had actively tried to crush and humiliate for the past week, marching toward the podium in a tailored power suit, completely short-circuited his brain. Jeremiah quickly recovered his senses, his confusion instantly boiling over into incandescent rage. He assumed I was launching a desperate, unhinged public protest. He thought I was coming to scream about my grandfather and ruin his meticulously orchestrated press conference. I watched his eyes dart toward the side of the room. I saw him make a sharp, frantic hand gesture to the private security team flanking the stage. Two massive men wearing dark suits and earpieces immediately detached themselves from the shadows and moved to intercept me at the base of the stairs. They stepped firmly into the center of the aisle, crossing their arms to form a physical barricade. But I did not break my stride. I did not hesitate. I did not lower my gaze. I locked eyes with the lead guard, projecting an aura of such absolute, impenetrable ownership that he physically faltered. I was not a disruptor. I was the person holding the leash to the entire Sterling Empire. My crisis management team had already provided my photograph and credentials to the hotel's executive management earlier that morning. The lead guard reached for his earpiece, listened to a frantic voice on the other end of the radio, and immediately stepped back, grabbing his partner by the shoulder and pulling him out of my way. I walked up the velvet-lined stairs to the stage. The silence in the ballroom was so heavy, it felt as though the atmospheric pressure had dropped. The flashing strobes of the press cameras had ceased entirely, the photographers sensing that the rehearsed corporate narrative had just violently derailed. I stopped 3 feet away from my father and my brother. Up close, the panic radiating from them was palpable. Jamal stepped forward, his chest puffed out in a pathetic display of physical intimidation. He leaned in his face, contorted into an ugly, desperate snarl, keeping his back angled toward the cameras so the audience could not see his hostility. "What the hell are you doing?" Zuri Jamal hissed, his voice trembling with furious panic. "Get off this stage right now before I have you physically thrown out of this hotel. You are making a complete fool of yourself. You are ruining my moment." Jeremiah stepped around Jamal, his face tight with barely suppressed fury. He maintained a rigid, terrifying smile for the hundreds of people watching, but his eyes were completely dead. "I told you to sit in the back," Jeremiah muttered through gritted teeth, the veins in his neck bulging against the collar of his custom shirt. "I will absolutely destroy you for this. Turn around, walk down those stairs, and leave this building, or I swear to God you will never work in this city again." I did not flinch. I did not react to their threats. Their words were nothing but the empty, meaningless rattling of caged animals. For decades, they had used their volume and their status to force me into submission. They had built their entire kingdom on the assumption that I would always fold. But looking at them now, stripped of their illusions, I realized they were not titans of industry. They were just desperate men standing on a trap door. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. It contained the finalized, internationally notarized acquisition contracts, the debt transfer deeds from Obsidian Equity, and the master liens on every single asset the Sterling family possessed. I stepped directly into Jeremiah's personal space and shoved the thick folder squarely against his chest. Reflexively, instinctively, his large hands came up to grasp the heavy documentation. The sheer shock of the physical contact made him freeze. In that exact singular fraction of a second, while both his hands were occupied holding his own financial death warrant, I reached out and wrapped my fingers around the microphone. I did not ask for it. I did not wait for him to yield. I smoothly, forcefully stripped the microphone right out of his trembling hand. I turned my back on my father and my brother. I stepped up to the acrylic podium, planting both hands firmly on its edges. I looked out over the sprawling sea of elite executives, society figures, and hungry journalists. I found Valerie sitting in the second row, her face completely drained of color, her hands pressed tightly over her mouth in absolute horror. I saw Ashley frozen in the VIP section, looking like she was about to physically be sick. The microphone crackled slightly as I leaned in. My voice echoed through the grand ballroom, crystal clear, unwavering, and completely merciless. "Thank you, Jeremiah," I said, allowing a razor-thin smile to touch my lips. I paused, letting my name, my presence, and my absolute authority wash over the room. I looked directly into the lenses of the television cameras at the back of the hall. As the sole owner and managing director of Apex Global Holdings, I continued, my voice ringing with lethal precision, the firm that just successfully acquired your $25 million defaulted debt. I have an announcement to make. The reaction was instantaneous and entirely visceral. A collective audible gasp ripped through the ballroom. It was the sound of 100 corporate paradigms shattering all at once. The reporters in the back row practically leaped out of their seats, camera shutters firing in a blinding, chaotic frenzy. The real estate developers who had just been celebrating Jeremiah's genius were now staring at me with a mixture of profound shock and genuine, unadulterated fear. The carefully curated narrative of sterling family unity and triumph was instantly annihilated, replaced by the staggering reality of a hostile corporate takeover executed from inside their own bloodline. Behind me, I heard the sharp, frantic rustle of heavy paper. Jeremiah had ripped open the manila folder. Jamal was leaning over his shoulder, his breathing loud and erratic. I did not need to turn around to know exactly what they were looking at. They were looking at the master acquisition sheets. They were looking at the Obsidian equity buyout confirmations. They were reading the merciless cross-collateralization clauses that legally signed over their operational licenses, their dealership inventory, and the deeds to their personal mansions. And right at the bottom of the final page, stark and undeniable in bold black ink, they saw my signature. The color completely drained from Jeremiah's face, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly gray. The heavy manila folder began to shake violently in his hands as the tremors traveled up his arms. Jamal let out a strangled, suffocating sound, stumbling backward, as if he had been physically struck, his arrogant posture completely collapsing. The realization hit Jeremiah with the devastating, unstoppable force of a freight train. He looked at the paperwork, and then he looked at the back of my tailored suit. His despised scapegoat daughter, the woman he had actively tried to erase and humiliate, the woman he had deemed completely irrelevant, had not just ruined his press conference. She had just bought his entire life. I stood at the acrylic podium, planting both hands firmly on its edges, and looked out over the sea of upturned faces in the St. Regis Grand Ballroom. The silence was absolute, thick with the electric tension of a carefully constructed reality completely imploding. I adjusted the microphone stand with a sharp metallic click that resonated through the massive speakers. Jeremiah stood frozen to my left, his mouth slightly parted, his breathing ragged and shallow. The manila folder I had shoved into his chest was now clutched in his hands like a physical anchor, though it contained the very documents that were dragging him to the bottom of the ocean. Jamal was practically vibrating with a mixture of terror and suppressed rage, his eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for an exit that simply did not exist. For the past hour, you have listened to speeches about resilience, about unshakable foundations, and about the triumphant future of the Sterling Auto Empire. I began, my voice steady, carrying an icy, unyielding clarity that commanded the immediate attention of every journalist and executive in the room. You were invited here today to witness a historic partnership to celebrate a massive injection of private equity that would supposedly secure my family's legacy for generations to come. That was the narrative you were sold. But as the chief executive officer of the firm that now holds the master keys to this entire kingdom, it is my absolute duty to present you with the truth. I unlatched the brass locks of my leather briefcase. The sharp snaps echoed loudly across the quiet room. I retrieved a thick stack of bound, professionally printed financial dossiers. I stepped out from behind the podium and walked down the short flight of stairs to the front row where the primary board members, major private investors, and city officials were seated in stunned anticipation. I began handing out the dossiers one by one. The men and women in the VIP section took the heavy packets with hesitant, trembling hands, their eyes wide with morbid curiosity. I walked past Ashley, who was still paralyzed in her seat, her face ashen and completely devoid of her previous arrogance. I invite the board of directors to turn to page 1 of the Apex Global Holdings summary report. I instructed, ascending the stairs and returning to the microphone. What you are holding in your hands is the true, unredacted financial reality of the Sterling Auto Empire. This company is not expanding. This company is not experiencing a temporary liquidity crisis. This company is completely catastrophically bankrupt. A chorus of shocked gasps and frantic whispers erupted from the front row as the investors flipped open the dossiers. I watched their eyes scan the bold red numbers, their expressions morphing from profound confusion to outright horror. The downtown commercial expansion project that my father just proudly touted as the crown jewel of his legacy has been hemorrhaging capital for over a year. I continued projecting my voice over the rising tide of panicked murmurs. To cover the escalating construction deficits, the executive leadership completely drained the operational reserves of every legitimate dealership in our network. They leveraged physical inventory, they drained employee pension matches, and they took on massive toxic short-term debt just to keep the lights on in the showrooms. The Sterling Auto Empire has not turned a legitimate profit in 18 months. I turned my head and looked directly at Jamal. He shrank back, his face glistening with a cold, terrified sweat. But financial mismanagement is only a symptom of a much deeper rot, I said, leaning closer to the microphone. When traditional banks understandably refuse to extend any further lines of credit to a failing enterprise, the Vice President of Operations, Jamal Sterling, sought out alternative funding. He turned to Obsidian Equity Partners, a shadow lending firm known for aggressive predatory terms. Jamal desperately needed $25 million to keep his downtown vanity project from being condemned by the city. But Obsidian Equity required a primary corporate guarantor. They needed the signature of the chief executive officer to authorize that level of institutional leverage. I paused, letting the silence stretch tightly across the room. The journalists in the back were rapidly typing on their laptops, their cameras recording every single second of the corporate slaughter. My father, Jeremiah Sterling, did not sign those documents. I stated, my voice ringing with brutal, undeniable finality. He was entirely unaware of the Obsidian equity loan until the exorbitant interest payments began suffocating the company. The signature on the primary guarantor documents, the signature that legally bound this entire empire to a predatory shadow lender, was completely forged by his son. Absolute pandemonium threatened to break loose in the ballroom. The flashbulbs from the press area became a continuous, blinding strobe light. The board members in the front row were practically shouting at one another, violently flipping through the pages of the dossiers, finding the forensic handwriting analysis and the undeniable proof of the fraudulent transaction. I turned my attention entirely to Jeremiah. My father was staring down at the open folder in his hands. He was looking at the exact copies of the Obsidian contracts. He was looking at the undeniable proof of a federal crime committed by his own flesh and blood. The arrogant, untouchable titan of Atlanta commerce was crumbling before my very eyes. His shoulders sagged, his chest caving inward, as the absolute magnitude of the betrayal struck him. For his entire life, Jeremiah had operated on a simple, deeply flawed philosophy. He believed that Jamal was his rightful heir, a brilliant, visionary reflection of himself. He had elevated Jamal, protected him, showered him with unearned praise, and handed him the keys to the kingdom. Simultaneously, he had looked at me, the daughter who had spent years cleaning up their financial messes, and called me a failure. He had mocked my accounting degree. He had banished me from the family table because I dared to point out the cracks in their foundation. Jeremiah slowly, mechanically turned his head. His eyes, hollowed out and filled with an agonizing, devastating grief, locked onto Jamal. The illusion was completely shattered. There was no more golden boy. There was only a terrified, sweating criminal who had just destroyed his father's life to save his own ego. "Dad," Jamal stammered, holding his hands up in a pathetic defensive gesture. His voice cracked, high-pitched and completely desperate. "Dad, listen to me. I can explain. It is not what she is saying. She manipulated the paperwork. Zuri is lying. She just wants to destroy us." But Jeremiah did not speak. He just stared at his son, his face a mask of absolute paralyzing horror. The truth was written in the desperate panic of Jamal's eyes. Jeremiah realized in front of the entire city that he had spent his life shielding a parasite. He had sacrificed his reputation, his legacy, and his entire fortune to protect a boy who was too weak to build anything real, all while actively trying to destroy the only child competent enough to actually save them. As the new owner of this debt, I announced, cutting through Jamal's pathetic whimpering, Apex Global Holdings has exercised its right to call the loans due immediately. Due to the fraudulent nature of the initial collateral, every single cross-collateralization clause has been triggered. My firm now holds the master liens on every sterling dealership, the commercial land they occupy, the physical vehicle inventory, and the personal estates pledged as secondary guarantees. The lead investor, a formidable woman who had sat on the sterling board for over a decade, abruptly stood up from her front row seat. Her face was flushed with absolute fury. She slammed the dossier down onto her chair and pointed a trembling finger directly at my father. "This is a disgrace," she shouted, her voice cutting sharply through the chaos of the ballroom. "This is absolute criminal negligence. As a primary shareholder, I am officially calling for an immediate emergency vote of no confidence in Jeremiah Sterling and the entire executive management team. We demand a total asset freeze and a full federal investigation into these forged documents." Her declaration acted as a catalyst. The remaining board members surged to their feet, their voices joining together in a chorus of furious agreement. They were demanding resignations. They were demanding police intervention. The journalists were shouting questions over the noise, trying to get a statement from Jeremiah, who remained completely frozen at the edge of the stage, staring into the abyss of his own ruin. The sheer magnitude of the public humiliation finally snapped whatever tiny thread of sanity Jamal was holding on to. His entire world was evaporating. His country club status, his luxury penthouse, his unearned reputation as a business prodigy were all turning to ash in a matter of minutes. He let out a primal, enraged scream. "You ungrateful witch!" Jamal roared, his face contorting into an ugly mask of pure violence. He lunged across the stage, his hands reaching out violently, intent on grabbing the microphone from my hands, or perhaps grabbing me directly. He wanted to physically tear down the woman who had just publicly executed him. I did not move. I did not flinch. I did not even step back from the podium. Before Jamal could close even half the distance between us, the two massive security guards who had previously tried to block my entry up the stairs materialized on the stage with terrifying speed. They were no longer taking orders from the Sterling family. They had received their updated directives from the hotel management, who had been fully briefed by my legal team regarding the true ownership of the event space. The lead guard hit Jamal with the force of a freight train, driving his shoulder squarely into Jamal's chest. Jamal's feet left the ground. He crashed violently onto the polished wooden floorboards of the stage, the wind completely knocked out of his lungs. The second guard immediately dropped his full weight onto Jamal's back, pinning his arms behind him with brutal professional efficiency. Jamal thrashed wildly against the floor, his expensive suit tearing at the shoulder, his face pressed humiliatingly against the wood. He was spitting curses, crying out for his father, begging for someone to help him. But Jeremiah just stood there, clutching the manila folder, watching his son get pinned to the ground like a common trespasser. I looked down at Jamal struggling beneath the boots of my security detail. Then I looked out at the completely unhinged ballroom, watching the elite families of Atlanta tear the Sterling legacy to shreds. I smoothed the lapels of my charcoal suit, completely untouched by the chaos surrounding me. The rot had finally been exposed to the light, and I owned every single piece of the aftermath. The ballroom descended into absolute, unmitigated anarchy. The polite veneer of Atlanta's high society completely shattered, replaced by the raw, chaotic panic of investors realizing their capital had just evaporated. Board members abandoned their plush VIP seats and swarmed the edge of the stage, shouting demands, threatening lawsuits, and waving the financial dossiers in the air like weapons. The flashing of the press cameras became a blinding, continuous storm, capturing every agonizing second of the Sterling family's public destruction. Jeremiah stood paralyzed at the center of the stage, the manila folder slipping from his numb fingers to scatter across the polished floorboards. He looked down at Jamal, who was still pinned beneath the heavy boots of my security detail, writhing and spitting desperate, incoherent excuses. The reality of his ruin finally pierced through Jeremiah's towering ego. His pristine reputation, his lifelong legacy, and his entire fortune had not been stolen by me. They had been entirely dismantled by the son he had worshipped. Jeremiah took a slow, heavy step forward. He reached down, grabbed Jamal by the collar of his torn, expensive suit jacket, and hauled him halfway off the floor. The sound of the slap cracked through the ballroom like a gunshot, silencing the immediate front rows. Jeremiah struck his golden boy across the face with such absolute unrestrained fury that Jamal crumpled back against the wood, his lip instantly splitting. "You forged my name, Jeremiah!" roared his voice, cracking with a terrifying primal rage that stripped away decades of corporate polish. "You forged federal documents and mortgaged my entire life to cover your pathetic failures. You arrogant, stupid boy. You destroyed us." Jamal cowered on the floor, holding his bleeding mouth, entirely stripped of his unearned bravado. He was crying, sobbing loudly in front of the local news cameras, begging his father for forgiveness. But Jeremiah just turned his back in absolute disgust, running his hands over his face as the board members began screaming for his immediate arrest. Down in the VIP section, the reality of the implosion finally registered with Ashley. She watched her husband weeping on the floor of the stage, and she watched the angry mob of investors demanding federal investigations. The lavish, untouchable lifestyle she had married into was completely gone. She was legally bound to a man facing decades in a federal penitentiary, and she realized instantly that the money had completely vanished. Ashley did not hesitate. The opportunistic survival instincts that had guided her entire social climbing existence kicked into overdrive. She dropped the sweet victimized persona entirely. She stood up, her chair violently scraping against the carpet, and marched toward the edge of the stage. "Do not look at me!" Ashley screamed at Jamal, her voice shrill and dripping with absolute venom. "You lied to me. You told me this project was fully funded. You told me we were safe. I am not going down for your federal crimes, Jamal. I am not losing my reputation because you are an incompetent fraud." She ripped the heavy diamond engagement ring off her finger and threw it directly at his face. It bounced off the stage and rolled into the crowd. "I am calling my divorce lawyers right now," she spat, turning on her heel and shoving her way aggressively through the crowd of stunned reporters. She abandoned her husband on the floor without a single backward glance, entirely focused on saving herself from the incoming wreckage. I stepped away from the podium. The press conference was over. My work was entirely complete. I walked slowly down the stairs, stepping back onto the patterned carpet of the main floor. The shift in the room was immediate and profound. The elite members of the Buckhead community, the exact same people who had spent the last 2 years whispering about my failures and shunning me at country club events, physically backed away. They parted like the Red Sea, carving a wide, clear path for me toward the exit. They did not look at me with the polite, condescending pity they usually reserved for the estranged Sterling daughter. They looked at me with a potent, undeniable mixture of absolute awe and genuine terror. They realized I possessed the capital, the intellect, and the sheer ruthlessness to completely dismantle a dynasty without breaking a sweat. I walked through the crowd, my expression completely impassive. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my mother. Valerie was standing near the back of the room, her pristine white dress looking entirely out of place in the middle of the corporate slaughter. She was completely frozen, her eyes wide and vacant. She was watching the empire she had based her entire personality and social standing on evaporate into thin air. There would be no more society luncheons. There would be no more charity galas. She was no longer the matriarch of Atlanta's most powerful automotive family. She was the wife of a disgraced, bankrupt man and the mother of a federal criminal. As I moved past her row, the shock suddenly wore off. The survival instinct kicked in and Valerie lunged forward. She shoved past 2 stunned executives and rushed toward me, tears streaming rapidly down her perfectly contoured face. She reached out her hands, shaking wildly, desperate to grab onto the only lifeline left in the room. Zuri, wait! Valerie sobbed, her voice cracking with pure panic. Please wait. You cannot do this. You have made your point. You have proven you are the smartest one in the room. Just call off the liens. Please, Zuri. We are your family. I am your mother. Do not take our home. Do not take the house. We have nowhere else to go. She was playing the mother card, wielding tears and maternal guilt in a desperate final attempt to save her mansion and her status. I stopped. I turned and looked at the woman who had spent my entire life telling me to be quiet, telling me to wear beige, telling me to submit to the men who were currently destroying our legacy. I looked at her with ice in my veins. I felt absolutely nothing. You chose your family at Grandpa's dinner? I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any warmth. When you sat at that table and watched Jeremiah strip me of my inheritance to cover Jamal's failures, you made your choice. You chose them. I am just honoring your choice. Valerie let out a shattered, agonizing wail, reaching for my arm. I did not even have to signal. The two security guards who had pinned Jamal to the stage were already flanking me. They stepped forward, smoothly intercepting Valerie and firmly blocking her path. Escort her off my property, I instructed the guards without looking back. I walked out through the heavy mahogany doors of the St. Regis, leaving the screaming, the crying, and the absolute destruction behind me. In the immediate days following the press conference, the hostile takeover proceeded with ruthless mechanical efficiency. I did not allow for a single grace period. I did not entertain a single negotiation. Apex Global Holdings initiated immediate foreclosure proceedings on the Buckhead mansion. My legal team arrived at the estate with local sheriffs serving Jeremiah and Valerie with a 48-hour eviction notice. Simultaneously, my forensic accountants moved into the corporate headquarters. We liquidated Jamal's luxury downtown penthouse and seized all of his personal bank accounts to cover the massive deficit he had created. The federal authorities, alerted by the very public confession at the press conference, raided Jamal's temporary office. He was placed under federal investigation for multiple counts of wire fraud, bank fraud, and forging corporate guarantees. His passport was confiscated, and he was completely confined to the city limits pending federal indictment. Ashley, true to her word, served him with divorce papers less than 24 hours after the gala, legally severing herself from the sterling name before the asset freezes could touch her personal accounts. Jeremiah and Valerie, entirely stripped of their wealth, their pristine credit, and their beloved country club status, were forced to pack whatever personal belongings the courts allowed them to keep. With their mansion foreclosed and their bank accounts seized by Apex Global, they had absolutely no options left in the elite circles of Atlanta. They moved into a tiny, cramped, two-bedroom rented apartment on the far outskirts of the city, entirely isolated from the society that had once worshipped them. On a quiet Monday morning, exactly 2 weeks after the ballroom implosion, I drove my car up to the front entrance of the flagship Sterling Auto dealership. The massive glass showroom gleamed under the bright morning sun. The Sterling family name had been entirely scrubbed from the building, replaced by the sleek, modern branding of Holloway Automotive. Elias, my lead asset manager, was standing by the front doors. He smiled sharply as I walked up the concrete steps, extending his hand. Resting in his palm was a heavy ring of master keys. "The transition is completely finalized," Elias said, his tone carrying a deep, professional satisfaction. "The inventory is secured, the staff has been retained under new contracts, and the toxic debt is entirely cleared from the ledgers. The empire belongs to you." I took the keys, feeling the cold, solid weight of the metal against my palm. The toxic chapter of my family's history was legally, financially, and physically closed. I pushed open the glass doors and walked into the showroom. It was time to look forward. I drove away from the Atlanta skyline, navigating the winding roads toward Grandpa Josiah's original countryside home. The air felt cleaner here, completely removed from the superficial elite circles of Buckhead. We sat together on his weathered wraparound porch. 2 glasses of sweet tea rested on the small wooden table between us. I reached into my bag and handed him a single crisp document. It was the deed to the newly restructured Holloway Enterprises, Every cent of Jeremiah's toxic debt had been surgically excised. Grandpa Josiah looked at the deed, a slow, deep smile spreading across his lined face. He looked at me and stated he always knew I possessed the steel spine required to protect the real family legacy. The manufactured sterling facade was dead buried under its own greed. The Holloway legacy, our true heritage, was finally secure. I sat back and watched the sky turn brilliant shades of amber and violet. I had not merely survived my family's rejection, I had purchased the ground they walked on. The ultimate truth was undeniably clear. Blood does not create a family, respect, loyalty, and truth do. Looking out at the sunset, I was entirely free. The ultimate lesson from this journey is that true family is never defined by bloodline, but by respect, loyalty, and unwavering support. This story teaches us that you cannot heal in the exact environment that breaks you. Walking away from toxic dynamics and quietly building your own empire is the most powerful response to lifelong manipulation. Authentic success built on integrity will always outlast empires constructed on lies. You hold the pen to your own narrative. Never allow those who consistently underestimate your worth to write your final chapter. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic environment to protect your peace and build your own legacy, share your story in the comments below and subscribe for more empowering journeys.